In this video, we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's begin. The most important updates are coming from the United States, where the 47th President, Donald Trump, issued an ultimatum to Russia and Vladimir Putin. Let's break down this statement in detail. Trump said, "I'm not looking to hurt Russia. I love the Russian people and have always had a very good relationship with President Putin, despite the radical left's stance on Russia and many other issues. We must never forget that Russia helped us win World War II, losing almost 60 million lives in the process. That being said, I'm going to do Russia and President Putin a very big favor. Settle now and stop this ridiculous war. It's only going to get worse if we don't make a deal soon. I have no other choice but to impose high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and other participating countries. Let's end this war, which never would have started if I were president. We can do it the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way is always better. It's time to make a deal. No more lives should be lost." In this statement, Trump made several mistakes, but these may not have been mistakes at all. He likely made them for a reason. The most important thing is not that Trump was attempting to push Putin into surrendering or something like that, and it's not just about sanctions. Russia has been living under sanctions for the past 10 to 20 years, and during the Soviet era, Russia faced sanctions as well. So, sanctions are not a huge problem for Russia. They will find ways to adapt and continue. The biggest problem, as I see it, is that Trump is trying to force Russia to accept everything Western, to abandon its own history. Trump's statement that we must never forget that Russia helped us win World War II, losing almost 60 million lives in the process, is the biggest mistake he made in this context. According to the Russian understanding of history, the Soviet Union won World War II, losing almost 60 million lives in the process. The Western countries, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and others, helped the Soviet Union win the war. This is where Trump made his biggest mistake, as his statement implies that Putin should accept that the United States and Western countries won the war, and the Russians were just helping them. Putin will never accept this. It's a completely different interpretation of history. This statement forces Russia and Putin to reject their own historical understanding. By the way, Putin's father died during World War II. And now Trump wants Putin to accept that his father, who gave his life during the war, was helping the United States win the war. Putin will never accept this. When I read this part of the ultimatum, I realized that maybe Putin didn't even read further into the statement because everything was flawed from the start. So, we'll have to wait and see how the Russians respond to this. In related news, another interesting and important figure is planning a visit to Russia. We're talking about Lex Fridman. You may recall that he interviewed Zelensky just a few days ago. According to the information we have, Fridman has announced his intention to visit Russia to interview Putin. Most likely, Putin will make several significant statements during this interview about Biden, about the former president of the United States, about Donald Trump, about Zelensky, and many other topics. This interview could give us a final understanding of whether the Russians will accept the ultimatum or continue fighting until the last, just as they did during World War II. Now, let's discuss the situation in Europe. The United Kingdom is preparing itself to confront Russia after the conclusion of the conflict with Ukraine. The West is preparing for war with Russia after the end of the Ukraine conflict, as stated by the Times. The British Ministry of Defence claims that after the settlement of the Ukraine conflict, there will be a revival and restoration of Russia. Of course, Western countries will never accept this and will do everything they can to prevent Russia from reviving and restoring itself. There will be a new military race, a weapons race, a new phase of the Cold War, and many other developments. This information has been confirmed by various sources, so let's wait and see what happens next. Meanwhile, there has been a lot of discussion and statements made about Zelensky and the peacekeeping efforts. He mentioned that the most important thing when talking about this peacekeeping content is that the United States of America will be a part of it. Zelensky said that at least 200,000 Western peacekeepers would be needed to guarantee security after the war in Ukraine, and several thousand U.S. troops should be part of this operation. Of course, this is another issue that Russia will never accept. It doesn't matter whether there is a presence of Western countries or NATO forces along the line of contact. It's the same. It means that sooner or later, within 10, 20, or 30 years, Ukraine will join NATO, and Russia will face serious problems as a result. Now, let's discuss the situation on the ground. First, let's talk about the south in the Dan direction, where the Russians have begun encircling and clearing the settlement of Vysova. During the previous 24 hours, we saw several changes on the ground. For example, this was the situation by the end of January 22nd, and this is the situation by the beginning of January 23rd. As you can see, only a few streets were captured by the Russians. However, the most important point is that control over these streets allowed the Russians to cut off the southern part of the settlement, leaving the central and northern parts as two different areas. The southern part is now completely cut off from the mainland, and the Ukrainians currently located in this area have no way to evacuate, either to escape the cauldron or to surrender. The Ukrainians in the northern part still have chances to evacuate, but they are suffering huge losses. During the previous night, the Ukrainians attempted another effort to cross the Mraya River to escape the encirclement, but the Russians discovered their positions and the crossing point. The Russians then began bombing and attacking the area with artillery and FPV drones. It's difficult to determine whether the Russians managed to destroy the entire evacuation group, but it's clear that the Ukrainians suffered significant losses. The Russians now control the Mraya River completely, and the Ukrainian losses attempting to cross it could be as high as 100%. Furthermore, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the northernmost part of Vysova. During the previous night, they began bombing and attacking this territory with multiple launch rocket systems and Strauss systems. The Russians understand that as long as the Ukrainians in this area have the possibility of escape or access to some roads leading to the river, they will continue their attacks. However, the Russians' primary goal is a media victory. They want to publish the capture of thousands of Ukrainian prisoners of war. This suggests that, most likely, on January 23rd, the Russians will attempt to attack in this direction to cut off the northern part of the settlement and several streets. This would leave the Ukrainians with no chances of evacuation. Now, let's turn to the Kurak direction. According to the information we have, the Russians have managed to improve their positions slightly in the vicinity of the settlement of Yentar. As you can see, the changes on the ground are evident. Additionally, we have information that during the previous night, the Ukrainians attempted a counterattack against the Russians from the settlement of DNA in the eastern direction, possibly with the goal of answering the Kuraha power station. I'm not sure of the exact objective of the attack, but the video you're seeing shows the Ukrainian forces' movements. The Ukrainians might have just been trying to slow down the Russians or buy time for evacuation from the settlement of DNA itself. In the video, you can also see how the Russians were following and controlling the movements of Ukrainian vehicles. When the Ukrainians began landing, the Russians acted accordingly. The Russians began bombing and attacking, and as a result of this fast, lightning counterattack, without clear purposes, the entire group of the Ukrainian armed forces was destroyed. Now, let's move forward. According to the information we have, the Russians continue their outflanking operation and are getting closer and closer to the Andrei fortified area. The Russians are using a broad frontline attack, and the Ukrainians are retreating. Let's continue. The battles in the Dnepr direction are ongoing. According to the information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the southern part of Novadva. This part of the village was captured by the Russians, according to neutral and pro-Ukrainian sources. Now, let's discuss the situation in the Pakhr direction. The Russians have most likely repelled every single attack carried out by the Ukrainians during the previous 48 hours. After the Ukrainians were completely defeated, the Russians continued advancing further in the northern direction, aiming to take control of Pakova, at least according to sources. Both pro-Russian, neutral, and pro-Ukrainian sources report that the Russians managed to take additional tree lines and have established complete control over these facilities, bringing them closer to the main Ukrainian positions in the area. As for the city of Pakhr, during the previous 24 hours, there were no significant changes. Another important direction is the Konstantinovka direction. According to different sources, the Russians managed to take control of the settlement of Baranova. If you remember, this same information was provided yesterday by pro-Russian resources, and today, neutral resources have confirmed it. Pro-Ukrainian sources have also confirmed this, but with the caveat that the Russians have only reached the outskirts of Baranova and have not yet fully captured the settlement. From the deep state updates, we have interesting details coming from the settlement of Zono. I would like to draw your attention to the zone between the settlement of Barova. Currently, the Russians are trying to outflank the Ukrainian positions and take Dilan, even before the battle for Baranova has finished. All these maneuvers suggest that the Russians are planning to advance further in the northern direction. Now, let's discuss the situation in the city of Tez. According to the information we have, the Russians have most likely begun their final assault operation. In this video, we can see how the Russians, using TOS-1A multiple launch rocket systems, are bombing the northernmost part of the mine, the last bastion of the Ukrainian armed forces in this direction. Most likely, after these heavy strikes, the Russians will begin a ground operation. Currently, there are heavy clashes, and by the time you watch this video, the Russians may have already secured the territory completely. The Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation might confirm this information. Moving on, let's discuss the situation in the Lemon direction. Today, the Russians, as a result of their offensive operation, managed to improve their position significantly. At least, this information was provided by pro-Russian and neutral sources. The Russians continue advancing, taking control of more and more strongholds in this direction. Once the Russians have taken as many strongholds as possible, they will face no major problems in advancing further toward Kody. The Ukrainians are losing the battle for Lemon, and it is difficult to predict what will happen next. The most important updates are coming from the northern Kops direction, where the Russians, during the previous 24 hours, managed to improve their position significantly. According to the information we have, the Russians captured the Pli forest and took control of positions to the south of Zapad. The Russians also improved their positions near Darish. Pro-Ukrainian sources today stated that the village of Darish was completely captured by the Russians. The situation for the Ukrainians is very difficult, and to summarize everything, we can conclude that the Russians now control everything inside the Red Square and Red Line. Sources indicate that once the Russians consolidate and gather a critical mass, they will continue advancing further in the southern direction, with the goal of attacking the settlement of Bad Ava. If the Russians manage to take control of everything in this area, they will be able to encircle the city of Kin, marking the end of the battle for this territory.